Hello, everybody, and welcome to this conference on. My name is Christine Mundwa, and I will be your host, joining you from the German capital, Berlin. It is an absolute pleasure to be in your company today. This conversation comes at a relevant time as people are being impacted by climate change and its effects. We're talking about floods, we're talking about droughts, and here we are having this conversation today. Much of it is leaning on cooperation, what we can do as an international community to protect the most vulnerable people. Just your stake in this conversation, Ottilie, from the Robert Bosch Stiftung's perspective. It's over to you now.
Thank you, Christine, and a warm welcome on behalf of the Robert Bosch Stiftung to this conclusive session of the conference. As we heard from experts during the first two sessions yesterday, climate change and environmental degradations are increasingly influencing human mobility patterns in Africa and beyond. At the same time, migration and displacement due to climate change are mostly internal, and mobility decisions are not simply a response to a deteriorating environment. Climate-induced mobility is intertwined with many different factors, and misconceptions around the issues are quite common. It is therefore essential to find sustainable and human-centered solutions and create a better understanding of how climate change transforms current and future migration and displacement patterns. As underlined yesterday, it's important to identify long-lasting solutions, and it requires bringing together stakeholders and experts from different fields and different regions. And we also must create synergies between the global, the local, and the regional levels. This conference is an important step in moving these issues forward, and I very much look forward to our discussion today. Thank you, and back over to you, Christine.
And thank you so much for that, Ottilie. It's been fantastic to hear from you. I did promise you a bit of a recap of the conversation that we had yesterday, and I am joined by Dr. Ingrid Hum. Ingrid is from the Global Perspectives Initiative. We're here together today. You will note that we have white on our outfits. Ladies and gentlemen, we come in peace. But Ingrid, as I promised our audience, we would like to just give a sum up of what we heard yesterday. On the first panel, Ingrid, we heard from voices from Chad, we heard from voices from IGAD, we of course got numbers. It was about the facts and figures of climate change migration in sub-Saharan Africa. Just be so kind as to sum up some of the takeaways that we had from that conversation.
I guess two of the most important takeaways are that climate change is an external shock brought to Africa, not invented there. And the other is that climate change has different consequences. Right. One is disaster, of course, that's immediately, and then there are those onset events that come very, very slowly. So we have to distinguish in between both of them, and both are very, very important. We talked a lot about disaster. Yeah. And disaster is increasing, and nowadays is already more important than conflict. 3.5 million people last year had been affected by it, and floods are the major issue. So floods are what experts are concerned mostly about. Yeah. But nevertheless, droughts are a huge problem as well. We talked about the Lake Chad. That's right. And it's gone. 90% of the water is gone already, and 60% of the species living there are disappeared. So what does it mean? It does mean that the men have to migrate to some place where they can work. Yeah. They leave their families back home. Pastorals and farmers start fighting against each other, yeah, because there's not enough crop and not enough acres. So this is a huge problem. Right. If you destroy the nature will fight back.
That's right. Yeah.
So this was what we discussed in the first panel.
You know, interesting you say all of that. And then, of course, so this was more about where we laid all the facts and the figures and some of the things we heard. I mean, you talked about Lake Chad. Devastating to hear how that was impacting people's livelihoods. Ingrid, in the second panel, we had strong voices from Sierra Leone. I don't know if you remember in 2017, those mudslides that ravaged the capital, Freetown. We were able to see that in picture. But we had the mayor on, and of course, a member of parliament on the panel as well. We had a representative from IOM, because the phenomena that's taking place is our cities in Africa are growing. In fact, we remember the question we put to the audience, Ingrid, and we asked, of the world's 15 fastest growing cities, how many of them were in Africa? Many of us were surprised to learn all of them. All 15 of the world's fastest growing cities are on the continent of Africa. And that tells you that there is a lot of migration to our cities. So just sum up what we heard in the second panel for us, Ingrid.
A very important learning is that migrants or migration caused by disasters, people stay in the region.
Yeah.
They try to stay as close as they can. So what they do is they migrate to the cities looking for jobs and labor. And this is an influx the cities cannot easily deal with. This informal influx causes a lot of problems, infrastructural problems. For the people, it means poverty, it means lack of education, it means a lot of different problems. For the city, it is an increasing environmental problem. Yeah. So those people increase the environmental problems the cities have. And energy, we had a special look at energy.
Exactly.
Because 85% of the population in Africa still use firewood. What of course makes forests disappear.
Yeah.
Huge environmental problem. So we need to replace this by electricity. Cities need a lot of energy.
Yeah.
So this means we need invest into green, of course, energy. And this green energy needs investment from all over the world. So this is something we will discuss today. And that green energy, but also can be a kind of a way out of the crisis, the actual COVID-19 crisis,
yeah.
which increased
yeah.
all the problems by large. And again, it's a shock that came from outside. It was not invented in
right.
Africa. But maybe that gives a kick to that Green Deal we are talking about. And that can be a huge, huge option for Africa on the other side.
That's right. That presents a wonderful opportunity. So, thank you so much. I wouldn't have done a better job myself in summarizing that. She's lifted the load, basically. A for effort for that, Ingrid, in terms of just summing up the core of the conversation that we had yesterday. I will let you go now because I know you're keen and eager to get into the conversation that we're going to be having today. So, ladies and gentlemen, I did tell you that my journalism home at the moment happens to be the Deutsche Welle, and I'm really proud of the work that my colleagues have done in terms of just giving us a visual representation of what the conversation is about. So I have a clip that I would like for us to all see. I know you're eager to hear from our participants. I can assure you, I can see them. They're standing by. We're ready and good to go. Just have a look at this now. And then straight after that, we'll get into the conversation. So here it is, ladies and gentlemen.
Just 3.7% of all human-produced carbon dioxide is emitted in Africa. Despite that, some parts of sub-Saharan Africa could in the future grow uninhabitable. Experts say 143 million people could be displaced due to climate change in regions south of the Sahara, in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia by 2050. The UN's Global Compact for Migration was agreed to foster more safe, orderly, and regular migration. But it doesn't include any legal frameworks to address those who are displaced due to the effects of climate change. Should Europe turn into even more of a fortress? Or should it instead look for more ways to make legal migration from Africa possible? Currently under discussion, a Green Deal for Africa. With an ambitious investment program to promote renewable energy production on the continent, the EU could play an even wider role in reaching international climate change goals, while at the same time creating jobs for many young people in Africa.
And there we have it. Of course, that brought to you by the Deutsche Welle. A lot of challenging questions for us, and that's what we're going to be answering today. I don't want to waste any more time because I do want to give the floor over now to our keynote speaker for today. That will be Dr. Amina Mohammed, a woman I have much admiration for. She is currently joining us from Nairobi. She is Cabinet Secretary for Sports, Culture and Heritage in Kenya, and I am pleased to now hand over to her as she presents today's keynote address. It's good to see you, Dr. Mohammed. Thank you so much for being with us today. We spoke some Swahili yesterday. I'll speak more today, and I'll say Habari Jambo. Wonderful to see you. And tell me about the weather where you are. It's a chilly morning in Berlin.
Well, I actually almost feel guilty telling you how wonderful the weather is here in Nairobi. But it's really wonderful. It's about, I think, 28 degrees today. And and there's a bit of a breeze, so I cannot complain. I know what you're going through, so I can't complain.
Appreciate that. You can now take the floor and give us your address, Dr. Mohammed.
No, thank you very, very much. And let me just say how delighted I truly am to be here with all of you to discuss climate change and migration. And I will do it from an African perspective, but I also know that fellow compatriots have been discussing this yesterday and probably part of today, and therefore maybe most of what I'll be saying will not be entirely new. But let me be clear that even before the impact of climate change on the movement of people became such a global discussion, topical discourse as it is today, on the continent, and even more specifically in my neck of the woods in East Africa, climate variability, and particularly drought and floods, because we have them in sequence. We have drought and then we have floods, and then in both cases there's famine. So in that case, that has been a common driver of migration. Climate sensitive sectors such as rain-fed agriculture, but also livestock breeding by our pastoral communities have ensured an almost constant stream of movement from some regions to other regions, from the high-heat regions to regions that may provide some temporary respite before, obviously, that they're also hit by either drought or floods. But that's not just an East African phenomenon. In West Africa, millions of people also derive their livelihoods from sectors that are extremely vulnerable to climate change, including rising sea levels, and coastal ecosystems in the regions, as you all know, are being hit by rising sea levels, triggering floods, increased salinity, erosion, and disappearance of certain species of marine lives. The Sahel Sudanese region has also not been spared and is now perennially affected by extreme events, from floods, increases in temperature, and changing precipitation patterns. Already, desertification in the Sahel region has put the lives of an estimated 67 million people in the region at risk. Southern Africa, no exception either, similarly witnessed extreme weather events, recently epitomized by the tropical cyclone that hit many of the countries and was one of the most destructive ever recorded in the southern hemisphere. It left 400,000 people homeless in Malawi, in Mozambique, and in Zimbabwe. Distinguished delegates, excellencies, a look at key climate change indicators suggest that this situation is set to worsen. That from the crossroads that we are in today, we could easily be headed for a point of no return. And I actually like that terminology, and I'd like to thank the organizers and others who have used it and have came up with it. And among these indicators is rising temperatures. I was just reading the 2019 World Meteorological Report a few days ago on the state of climate in Africa, and it noted that 2019 was among the 3 warmest years on record for our continent. The report predicts continued warming and decreasing rainfall, especially over North and Southern Africa, and increased rainfall over the Sahel during the periods from 2020 to 2024. Now, besides temperatures, significant rising sea levels and coastal erosion have also been recorded, including on the East African coast. The report indicates that sea level increase will reach 5 millimeters per year in several coastlines on our continent. And this rate of increase, as you probably know, is above the average global sea level rise of 3 to 4 millimeters per year. There are concerns that if the world fails to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees, that Africa could reach a tipping point. This is not a remote prospect, considering the temperatures will certainly rise further due to past emissions, which Africa is definitely not responsible for. And I think you heard that from the clip that played just a few moments ago, but also continuing greenhouse gases emissions. Clearly, and although the continent is the least contributor to climate change, Africa will bear the brunt of the crisis. And this is, among other things, due to our own low income levels, weaker institutional frameworks, which limit our capacity to adapt to climate change. It's therefore extremely urgent, Excellencies, that the core commitments of the Paris Climate Change Agreement are stepped up to tackle climate change. I was privileged to have signed it on behalf of my country, and I think that an acceleration of the actions and investments that are needed for a sustainable, low-carbon future are critically important going forward. In addition to these commitments, and from the point of view of Africa, there's need to focus on building resilient societies in which people can adapt in place and prosper, so that there isn't need for continuous migration. In this regard, economic development remains one of the most effective ways to increase the capacity to adapt to climate change. Increased income levels will avail the fiscal space that is needed by our countries to finance public spending on climate-related public goods, such as investments in early warning systems. It also enables governments to invest in protecting programs affected by climate change, such as transport infrastructure, water, and health systems. The problem that we face, however, is that most of our governments are physically constrained, and especially now, following the drastic reduction in revenues, in part due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And although the situation is expected to change, progress will be moderate. This means the capacity of governments to finance adaptation to worsening climate impacts will be significantly compromised. The continent, therefore, Excellencies, requires increased financial and capacity building assistance in tackling climate change. While existing global solidarity and collaboration in combating climate change is encouraging, financial commitments in this regard remain modest, and they need to be scaled up urgently. More importantly, there is need to link climate change and migration interventions on the continent with poverty reduction. These 3 factors are mutually reinforcing and should not be viewed in isolation. Various types of poverty interact with climate shocks in different ways, worsening vulnerabilities and affecting the choice of response actions, including migration. We've also heard that what we do calls for all the actions we take call for a people-centered approach in which governments, civil society organizations, development partners would focus on building resilient communities through poverty reduction. This will involve working really closely with poor and vulnerable communities, encouraging them to express their climate adaptation needs and channeling resources to meeting exactly the needs that they would have identified. Focusing on people's experiences and expressed needs at the community level will not only help in responding to practical situations, but will also facilitate the uptake of remedial measures by those who need them the most. I think fuel wood was mentioned. Now, an alternative of electricity was also mentioned. Well, I think that, in fact, green energy would be the most appropriate. Unfortunately, it's extremely expensive and out of reach for most communities on the continent. Therefore, enhanced global solidarity on climate change and mobility in Africa is essential. It requires urgent implementation. A starting point for me would be the inclusion of climate change and mobility in Africa into the AU-UN framework on implementation of Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030 to align this framework with the Paris Agreement. The resulting structure excellencies will provide a rubric for African countries to mainstream and integrate climate change-related mobility into national planning frameworks on SDG 13, taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. I'd finally like to talk about political leadership, and I feel that political leadership with strong will and commitment to mutually agreed priorities and implementation plans concerning climate change must not only be identified, it must be intensified, and this commitment must be made. Lastly, collaboration in all important aspects, including joint financing, should be optimized. Now, let me finish by insisting that we cannot treat climate-related migration as just a clean, pure humanitarian crisis. I think we must look at addressing these complex issues through mitigation and adaptation. And I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Asante Sana, thank you very much for those remarks, Dr. Mohammed, coming to us there from Kenya with the call to action. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. For those opening remarks leading us into the conversation. For those of you who are wondering, who's that handsome young man who was looking over her as she was speaking? That is, in fact, the President of Kenya, President Uhuru Kenyatta. Good to see you both, I can say, from here. Okay, let's get into our conversation now. And I do want to tell you that we're now pivoting into that conversation. You heard the words cooperation coming there from Dr. Mohammed. We are now looking at global responsibility and the cooperation with Africa. And I'm pleased to tell you that we're in the midst of some very, very, very impressive people. I'll tell you quickly a little bit about them before we get into the conversation. Kamal Amakrane is the Special Advisor for Strategic Partnerships, supporting the UN's advancement of digital innovation for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, one of the things you will learn is that he was among the people who successfully mobilized for a coalition which pressed countries to commit to protecting those forced to leave their countries due to climate change. He's going to tell us a little bit more about that during the course of the conversation. Now, if you speak Spanish, English, French, Arabic, or even Amazigh, all of those languages you can have a conversation with Kamal in, because he speaks all of them fluently. Good to have you with us, Kamal. And we also have Kumi Naidu. Kumi is a human rights and environmental justice activist. Now, if you want to know a man who can put up a fight, it's Kumi. This is, of course, one of our anti-apartheid activists in South Africa who mobilized from a tender age. So he knows all about struggle, and he is now putting climate at the heart of his struggle. Kumi, it's good to have you. I know that he's joining us from Johannesburg. Now, ladies and gentlemen, all our plans need money. So we've made sure to invite somebody with a lot of it. And that is Kanta Kumari Rigaud from the World Bank. She is lead environment specialist and regional climate change coordinator for the African region of the World Bank Group. So not only does she come with money, she comes with expertise in climate change and migration. Kanta is, of course, a leading expert on climate adaptation and resilience, and she works on climate policy, strategy, and knowledge management. I'll particularly be probing you, Kanta, on what you are doing at the bank with regarding to the next generation, the Africa Climate Business Plan. This is something that she's leading at the bank as we take shape there. And then then we have Dr. Christoph Heusgen, who is currently the permanent representative of Germany to the United Nations. It's a post that he's held since 2017. Essentially, he's Germany's representative on the Security Council. Before that, he spent a good amount of time advising Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel on foreign and security policy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm excited that you are all here. Thank you so much for making the time. Ambassador, I do want to start with you because we're hearing that this is urgent. We heard it from Dr. Mohammed out in Kenya that this is urgent. Do you get the sense that the international community is treating the issue of climate change and, of course, the migration that it's fueling with the sense of urgency that people on the continent are calling for?
Well, thank you very much for including me in your discussion. When you followed this debate from the beginning, you have heard our State Minister, Ms. Müntefering, already give a presentation on German policy in general, so I don't need to cover that and concentrate on the action here in New York. And there, I must say that the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, always classifies climate change and the repercussions of climate change as the #1 challenge that we are facing globally. And he has been the driving force behind Climate Summit here. He goes to the COPs meetings and he brings it on the agenda again and again. So this is something where the UN is in the lead, and of course the climate office, the UN office in Bonn, to make some PR for my country here, is also in the lead in bringing this forward. Now, let me just add one point from the specific perspective of Germany in the Security Council. You mentioned that Germany 2019-2020 sits on the Security Council, so 3 more weeks. But for us, the nexus between climate and security was one of the key issues, perhaps the key issue that we brought to the attention of Security Council and we brought on the agenda. Because as we heard earlier in the contribution summarizing the discussions by Ingrid Hamm, talking about migration that is a consequence of climate change in the Lake Chad region. This is something that we have to look closer at. We have to look at from the perspective of consequences for security. If farmers and herders clash, there are conflicts. And so this is what we propose to the Security Council, to adopt a resolution which then puts it higher on the agenda of the UN on the security part, by having a special representative, by training peacekeepers to look out for possible climate-induced conflict, so that early on something can be done. So they have the training. We also have now established an informal expert group of members of the Security Council that constantly look in specific situations. We already looked at the situation in Somalia, which is in the neighborhood of Kenya. And I'm to turn to Amina Mohamed. Not only is this a very popular name here at the UN, the Deputy Secretary General has the same name, but we have now Kenya actually joining the Security Council, and they are dedicated to this climate, and we hope that they will also, as we have done in the Security Council, bring the theme of climate and security on the top of the agenda and convince those that are still reluctant. Reluctant are first, until now at least, our American friends who still don't see the logic between climate change and they don't recognize the phenomenon, but this will change. But then the challenges of those countries like China and Russia that have a very narrow view of security, they don't look at the comprehensive approach of security, that are blocking more action in the Security Council with regard to climate change and security and concrete action there. But with the help of Kenya that take over and the countries that are firmly behind this will be 11, 12 countries out of the Security Council that push this. I'm optimistic that the Security Council will assume its responsibility also with regard to the issue that we are discussing this morning or this afternoon in Germany. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks. And there are a few things I do want to follow up with you on that, Ambassador. But I do want to come to you, Kumi. You're listening to the Ambassador, some of the challenges that exist at a global level, some countries, some leading nations, the difficulty that it has been, of course, to mobilize them, to recognizing the challenge that we face. Just from where you sit, Kumi, what do you make of the global action on climate change from where you are?
Thank you, everybody, and greetings. Let me just say that it's always good to address or see a conference on Africa or concern around Africa being organized out of Berlin, because for Africans, we see the tragedy of Africa actually starting partly historically with the Berlin Conference, or known as the Congo Conference. And let me say that when I answer, and we embrace this as a gesture of solidarity and reconciliation. However, I think when we are talking about addressing the issue of migration in Africa or globally as a result of climate, the urgency that has been shown has been pathetic. That's the honest truth. In 2018, the IPCC told us that we had 12 years to get emissions to peak and start coming down drastically by the end of 2030 if we are to have a chance to avert catastrophic climate change. And I want to say something very uncomfortable here right now. As an African, I would say that we are in the front line together with the people of the Pacific, small island states, coastal regions, and so on. It just so happens that we're also not only dealing with the history, unbroken thread of racism flowing from slavery and colonialism until the present, we're also dealing with the problem of climate apartheid right now. So in the sense that the people that are paying the first and most brutal price look in a particular color, and those that historically carry the biggest weight of the... So we often wonder whether, in fact, the urgency would be much more if there were more urgent, immediate impacts happening in Europe and so on. Now, that's a very negative statement to start with, but let me just tell you why I'm... Basically, this is no time for us to be being pally-pally with each other and not talking about the contradictions that exist and not actually getting absolutely serious about speaking truth to power. We are running out of time, right? The tragedy that we have seen, that the African people have faced, has been, and not only African people, of course, people from Syria, other countries. As the head of Amnesty International, I'll tell you, I was in various refugee camps, internally displaced people's camps in Syria, in Kenya, in various places. But I can tell you the worst, most brutal, most horrific camp I saw was a camp that exists in Europe, right? In Lesbos, right? So I want to make a challenge in opening my comments here. There has certainly not been the urgency that we need. And to Europe, I want to use this occasion to say that there are two things very clearly Europe must come to terms with: that they carry historical responsibility for slavery, colonialism, for a dependency on fossil fuel and so on, and that what we need moving forward is brutal honesty. We need a recognition that the economic system is not working, and it is from this economic system that we get the kind of climate impacts and climate destruction. And we cannot, let me just conclude for now by saying we cannot emerge out of the post-COVID reality as we did after the global financial crisis. After the global financial crisis, what we saw from those with power was system recovery, system protection, system maintenance. What we need now to address climate, to address migration, to address a whole range of other issues, we need system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. Small incremental baby steps rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic as humanity sinks is not going to cut it. And Europe must recognize that the entire migration system, the entire migration protocols and so on, was created to support the people of Europe after the tragedies of the First and Second World War. If it was good enough for the people of Europe, surely it should be good enough for the people from Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and elsewhere who are now, facing these terrible tragedies. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kumi. I do want to, on that note, actually bring you now into the conversation, Kamal. We've been hearing about the migration systems and protocols. That's something that you're engaged in. I want to point out that today is the second anniversary of the latest Global Compact migration that you were involved in. I told the audience earlier that one of the things that it did is that it pressed countries to commit to protecting people who are forced to flee their countries of origin because of climate change. Perhaps explain just how meaningful that accomplishment was. I know that Kumi couldn't help but show us the harsh reality. But from where you sit, there have been some progress, at least in migration policy. Talk to us about how meaningful that is, and perhaps elaborate what it actually concretely means.
First, I would like to thank the organizers for the kind invitation to be part of this conversation. I'm also very pleased to be among familiar faces and friends. It's always a pleasure. And last but not least, I think this conversation is not only important, but it's timely as we're trying to gain momentum on advancing this issue forward on the top of the international agenda. So let's be plain, as it was mentioned by Kumi, this issue is real. Climate crisis is undeniably here, and the climate forced displacement, it's its human face. And I would like to emphasize why I use the word forced, because migration is voluntary in nature. If you go back to the definitions of IOM, which is the multilateral entity leading this response to this exercise or support of this exercise, it's voluntary. What we are discussing here is forced. This is not something that people decide to do. They are pressed to do. And I think it's very important to note this element. That's point one. Point two, when we speak about the continent, as was outlined earlier, we should not export the anxiety in the global north and placate it in the context of the African continent. What do I mean here? This is not an issue of migration when it comes to the continent. This is an issue of displacement and mobility. What do I mean? The continent has already agreed, the leadership has already committed to freedom of movement. It's something that we are working towards, it's something that we aim at, and it's something that we recognize will be key to the political and economic integration. And as such, this is not about migration. This is about how we manage mobility in a context of a crisis. I always outline, when someone moves from Berlin to Madrid, we don't say he or she migrated to Madrid. We say she or he moved to Madrid. This is the case. West Africa, as was mentioned earlier, the freedom of movement is there. So people do not migrate from Burkina Faso to Cote d'Ivoire. People do not migrate from Bamako to Dakar. They move to. So I think that those contradictions that are quite anchored in our conscience related to migration should not be carried forward in this space. We are talking about how we can help and support the continent further its political economic integration as we address the issue of mobility in the context of the climate crisis. And this is not climate change, it's a crisis. And to build on this, it was the small island and the African group that led this effort during the negotiation of the compact, emphasizing the need to recognize in the important document, which was the first time we addressed the issue of migration comprehensively, the aspects related to the climate crisis. When you come to the continent, I think it's an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity for the continent to build its own narrative and is engaged with its partners outside of the continent. I think it's an opportunity to further its political and economic integration. But as it was said earlier by some of the colleagues, this cannot be prescriptive. This should be done hand in hand with the continent. Point one. Point two, this is not about a couple of millions of dollars or $1 or $2 billion. This is a major exercise if we are to reinforce and support the continent to be at ease with itself, to fully engage with its partners. Third, last but not least, this is not about Europe. I saw the clip, and when the clip they were talking about the borders and they were talking about the fences, this is what the common psychic brings forward every time we talk about migration. This is about the continent, its potential and its future. So I think there is a major mindset shift that needs to happen. And we should get out of the conversation about migration. You know, I worked in the continent, I moved around the continent. I was never a migrant home. You can't tell me as an African, I am a migrant somewhere else. And I always, and I say this with tremendous emotion, the European in Africa is an expat, and the African in Europe is a migrant.
Oy.
It can't continue like that. Over to you.
Yeah, and you know, I feel that passion coming through from you. And I guess I want to bring you now into the conversation, Kanta, because, you know, we're hearing from Kamal that it's not just a few $billion that we're going to throw at this. One of the things that the bank has told us to brace for potentially is the fact that by the year 2050, Kanta, about 86 million people in sub-Saharan Africa alone could be displaced as a result of climate change. But the bank has also said that 80% of that displacement could be avoided if we have ambitious mitigation and adaptation measures. And I wondered what those could be. Kanta, could you share that with us?
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you. I joined my other panelists to say, you know, I think this is an important conversation, so I'm really happy to be a part of it. But coming back to your very pointed question, I think the numbers you're quoting come from a report we put out called The Groundswell, Preparing for Internal Climate Migration. And you're right. I think we took a very, tacit look at what were the issues and what was driving migration. Not just the current crisis, we are in a crisis right now, but how this is going to unfold in the future, and not the long future. It's as early as 2030 that we will see some of this. And even now we see those displacements. And what we found is that, you know, yes, that is the scale that could happen in the worst case scenario, you know, of 85 million people driven as a consequence of water stress, drops in crop productivity, sea level rise, compounded by storm surge. But what we also looked at was, what does it mean in terms of the policy shifts that we could have? And overarchingly, what we found is that the potency for climate to drive the mobility was higher than sometimes what the development aspects could the returns we could get. So unconditionally, I think it's really, really important for us to reduce those carbon emissions. I woke up to the very sobering report from UNEP today on the emissions gap. And sadly, not only are we at 1 degree, but we are heading to 3 degrees. Nothing has changed in terms of the emission pathways. And we need to do something really drastic to shift that, because that impact is going to be disproportionately on the poorest, the most vulnerable, and the least able to do it. So that brings us to the African context. But I also want to shift a little bit, I think, into the very inspiring and sort of pointed presentation by Dr. Amina. She really hit the nail on the head. I think we must be concerned about this distress-driven migration. But we really have to turn the conversation and not ring-fence the issue too much, because the underlying causes that are causing people to move are much more, much broader, and we need to address those. And that really brings us back, you know, let me not forget, I mean, it is about reducing the emissions in the context of climate change. There's no two ways about it. And we need to really push that. And we have countries who need to take responsibility, and meanwhile help other states, particularly those in Africa, who don't have energy. 50%, 500 million people don't have energy access in Africa. We need to help them to get energy access, and we need to help them get green energy access with the technology, the capacity, and the financing, because energy access is the number one enabler of resilience. Let's not forget that. So we need to drive that. But we also need to help them to make sure that you have the jobs that are really, really important and the economic transitions that need to happen alongside that. A lot of these fundamental development things are being pushed back and sort of challenged in the context of climate change. So, Christine, I'd like to just maybe, right now or later, share with you what we think is so fundamentally important to the African context in making that progress. We know that climate is here, the reality is here, the migrants are going to increase, but more than the migration, I think we want to look at the economic prosperity and the shared economic growth and the shared prosperity, which is about equity. That really has to be addressed. And I can come back to the business plan, but I just wanted to say we really have to look at this issue beyond migration, look at the underlying causes that are really, going to be bearing hard on the African context, as the other panelists have pointed out.
Thank you so much, Kanta, and I definitely will be coming back to you on the point of that business plan. Ambassador, I want to bring you back into the conversation, and perhaps I will afford you the opportunity to perhaps answer to some of the things that you've heard from the other panelists. But my main question to you now is this. Kanta has just told us that we must anticipate more people having to move as a result of climate change. What is more realistically feasible, do you think, in terms of executing? Is it securing people's livelihoods where they are, or trying to access or create more legal pathways to migration? So two things I'm asking you to do there, I guess, is one, to answer some of what you've already heard, and of course this last question I put to you about what we can realistically do. Do we open more pathways for migration, or do we try and meet these ambitious climate targets that we're having a hard time trying to achieve?
No, there's no simple answer, of course, to this. It was mentioned before that it's exactly 2 years ago that the Global Compact on migration was adopted in Morocco, and Chancellor Merkel was one of the few heads of state who actually went there and committed to it, although this compact was fiercely debated in many countries. And I think that's a good basis. Of course, when you look at Germany, we have been one of the countries that has accepted and integrated, and very well integrated, a huge number of refugees. You remember 2015, when we almost had 1 million refugees fleeing from the Syria crisis and accepted in Germany. On a positive note, those who are following football, look at our 2014 team that won the World Cup. Without immigration, we would have not won that World Cup. So it is to the benefit. When you look at the vaccine that is on the market, BioNTech, Pfizer, it's in Germany by a family of migrants that were the key in this area. So we benefit from migration, and it is something very, very positive. But we have to look, of course, also at the countries of origin, so to speak. Migration or to have more expats or whatever you call it is not the solution. So we have to go look at the root causes. We have to see to it that in Africa we of course look at the energy. I think it's really a shame that we are not able to prevent more coal power plants to be built, which is actually happening in Africa, and it's financed by countries outside Africa. I think this is a mistake. We should do much more, as it was said before, invest in green energy. And Germany is one of the major donors there of the Green Climate Fund. And in general, we are we are the second largest donor to the overall UN system, where you have climate mitigation as one of the key issues. So we of course will continue to accept migrants. It's to our benefit. It's good to provide this help, but the solution is not there. The solution is to see to it that Africa copes with problems, and that is, of course, climate change. But let me also say, and the previous speaker, Kanta, just said that about looking at the much broader picture. And I think we have to see, in all honesty, that there has to be more, let me say this a bit professor-like, there has to be more good governance. We have to see that the institutions in African countries are established. We have to see that democracy functions, that civil society has a say. I don't need to name countries where we have elections and how difficult it is to have the constitutions observed. We have again a terrible conflict in Ethiopia. To have this resolved by military means is just a nightmare. And we have to see that that these conflicts are resolved by peaceful means. And there, the African Union is also called upon to do more. African solutions to African problems. More has to be done there. There are 50,000 Ethiopians that have now fled to Sudan, and there are more. And the UN access to this area is very difficult to achieve. So there are many causes, and we don't have the time to look at all of this, but it's a complex situation. Of course, it's the responsibility of Europe, but I can say for our part, Germany, Chancellor Merkel has been at the forefront and working on this, trying to do utmost, and we will continue to engage with Africa. We have the compact with Africa, where we look at specific countries where there is good governance, etc. But as it said before, the causes are much broader, and we have to be honest and look at the broader picture.
But Kumi, I want to talk to you about something that somebody in the audience has asked now. I just want to remind people, one of the things we also learned yesterday was many people don't want to move or to migrate. People are quite happy living on the continent that they're on, but it's often the toss-up between I have better prospects elsewhere. But you heard about the wonderful weather, you saw the landscape. Africa is an amazing place, and for the most part, people really do want to stay there. So Kumi, here's where you come in here. How do we mitigate the negative impacts of climate change while also finding context-specific solutions? So let's discuss some context-specific solutions in terms of how we then combat this. I mean, you've got the people here listening, the policymakers, a lot of them in our audience as well. So from your perspective, let's discuss that, these context-specific solutions that we can employ to mitigate the impacts of climate change that is now forcing people to move.
Well, I mean, clearly we have to be looking at both push and pull factors, okay? And we need to look at what is pushing people away from home. And you speak to most refugees, most people in exile, overwhelmingly, the idea to leave home permanently and to risk everything, your identity, your family, your culture, and so on, is not a decision that people make lightly. Yeah. I think it's really important that we constantly remind ourselves, and I can say this as somebody who was a privileged person of, relatively had a scholarship and so on, but still, the possibility that you cannot go home is ever again, when people flee conflict, is a very horrifying thing. Now, I want to suggest that the current global migration protocols and policies and contracts and so on There have been improvements, I acknowledge that. But what we are concerned often is that we see so many UN conventions, compacts that get agreed, and there's such a low level of compliance and implementation. And for that reason, what I think is necessary right now is a dual approach. On the one hand, we need to get the best out of a broken system. And let's be blunt about it. The whole migration system is broken. It's, there's so many things we can talk about it. But let's get the best, let's try and make that system work as best as it can. And then we need to look at ways to complement it. And let me suggest very practically one initiative that's going on right now, which I'm been supporting, is an initiative called Migrant Nation, which is seeking to offer 21st century solutions to 21st century challenges. It enables displaced people to secure decent work by assessing digitalized global markets for goods and services. This supports the dignity and financial independence of displaced people, whilst easing the resource pressures on host communities. Migrant Nation's approach is to build and manage a digital platform that enables displaced people to establish a digital identity and credentials, access the digital economy, secure decent work conditions, and be assured of payment. To achieve this, both technology and market development and policy engagement and developing an ecosystem of partnerships will be necessary. Now, this is one kind of out-of-the-box way of thinking that we need to complement a system that is actually not going to be able to provide the kind of basic lifeline to people to actually survive. So it needs a little bit of creativity and I mean, basically reminding ourselves what Albert Einstein once said, that the definition of insanity is doing exactly the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. When something is failing, it's incumbent on us to look at new ways of doing things, or alternatively, what complementary things need to be done to existing ways of working. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Ambassador, of course, you're back in the hot seat because you have 10 more minutes before you have to leave us. Kumi also talked about rearranging the deck chairs as the Titanic sinks here. You are, of course, in the last few days, I guess, of your role there at the UN Security Council, one of the things that's glaringly obvious is that a permanent African voice is missing on the Security Council. I just wanted to get your take on just how important it is that we perhaps do see that change happening at that level, having a permanent representative on the Security Council who can speak for the African voice. And I know that that's something that you've particularly advocated for.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the Kumi before said that we have so many resolutions and decisions and conventions, and they're not really implemented. Germany is a country that puts a lot of weight on the rules-based international order, that when we have a rule that is adopted, then it's actually implemented. And therefore, us, the UN is at the helm of this. And for the UN to remain credible, the Security Council needs to change. The composition of the Security Council actually reflects the realities after the Second World War, but it doesn't reflect the reality of today. And we have been pushing for a reform of the Security Council, and Germany has put its weight fully behind the common African position. The common African position is that there should be more African, there should be 2 African countries that have permanent membership in the Security Council, and we support that. We think that it's not enough, although they are working very effectively together, the so-called A3, that there are 3 non-permanent members, but this is just not fair. It has to change, because if we don't change the composition, people will say, well, the Security Council doesn't have any legitimacy anymore and doesn't have any relevance anymore. So we should push there. sometimes, and I must say this very open, we are a bit surprised that although Africa has this ambition, we see here in New York, Africa a bit dragging its feet. And just in the last year when we had the COVID situation, it was Africa that was actually the African countries that were not in favor of having virtual debates exactly on the reform of the Security Council. And there are countries that are in the background, maybe directing the African position there. But this is something I'm concerned about, and I would only encourage you, Kumi and others, to push your governments to say very clear and insist that the composition of the Security Council is changed. We have been debating this for years with no outcome, and we urgently need that.
Okay.
Back to you.
Ambassador, and one more. I know you've got to go in now, what is 6 minutes. One more for you. Continuity. I mean, Germany is about to give up its seat now, the rotating seat on the Security Council. You referred often to Chancellor Angela Merkel, who's been very much leading the charge as a global leader. We do expect Chancellor Merkel's political career to come to an end next year. So what happens now in terms of who is taking that space in managing this crisis from where you are? Because I know from the notes, and you did allude to the fact that much of your efforts have been frustrated by bigger powers, the Russians, the Chinese as well, the Americans. We now have a new administration. Just your final thoughts on that regard.
Yes. We must get away from a situation where political development is dependent on individual persons. We have to see, and this is our ambition here, this is the ambition that we launched during our time in the Security Council, the so-called Alliance for Multilateralism. We have to work, not Eurocentric, but we have to work together with like-minded countries worldwide to see to it that the rules-based international order is observed. This cannot be done by one country, by one person. And we were very fortunate in Germany to have Chancellor, and don't forget she's there for another year, and it will be a very active year. But this has to be something where responsibility is divided between all of us. And I don't think that this should be continents against each other, but this should be together. This alliance for multilateralism, where countries from all continents work together, work on the rules-based order, work on the major threats, that is climate change. This is a respect for human rights. This is humanitarian law. This is gender parity, and these issues. And we see here in New York also on the climate issue. We were so astonished how many people said, yes, let's go for it. Let's support it, even if we don't achieve this resolution this year. Let's go for it next year. And I alluded to Kenya, who will be a driving force, and others successors. So let's not depend too much on an individual person. Let's see to it that the system as such functions. And now I come back to what I said earlier. For me in Africa, it is so important that you not only have Angela Merkel's in Africa, but that you have the institutions that guarantee if one of your leaders steps down, the institutions are so strong that that policy is continued afterwards. So thanks very much for having me.
Oh, well, we thank you and we appreciate your time, of course, as you're winding down at the UN, Ambassador. And I'll tell you this, I've been impressed by your performance, and I know you're about to be out of a job. So you know what, I'll give you the option. You can send me your CV. I'm well connected on LinkedIn, and I'm sure we can arrange something for you. How does that sound, Ambassador? Do you want to tell us what's next on the horizon for you before you leave us?
No, what you just said, be careful what you say. I might try to get your job afterwards.
Okay, in that case, you can leave right away, Ambassador. Thank you so much. That is Ambassador Christoph Heusgen, of course, representing Germany at the UN Security Council. Thank you so much for that. Let's continue with the conversation now. And I do want to come back to you, Kamal, based on everything that we've heard. We've talked about policy being put together, but it not being implemented. Just your reaction to that. And then security policy is a big part of the conversation, Kamal, and something you said struck me. You said that the security agenda is of divide and reject. How do we shift the mindset in that regard?
Somehow I belong to the school that does not believe that the issue of climate action and climate engagement, particularly as it relates to forced mobility, belongs in the Security Council. Why? Because the Security Council has already many challenges and has difficulties to reach consensus and to move forward in a collaborative way. If we add another challenge of multilateral importance, of serious impact on the population, on the agenda of the Council, we may be faced by the same contradictions we are seeing on other issues. That's point one. Point two, the Council was built to address address specific issues and to represent a balance of power post 1945. I personally do not want to put the fate of 1.5 billion Africans in the hands of the permanent five. We need to fully understand where do we stand today vis-a-vis the relationship between climate crisis and forced displacement and forced mobility in the country. So I just would like to go back where to go from here, because I think it's time to be focused on the future and how we can come together to address this and to empower the African continent as much as responsibilizing Africans at large. I think, as mentioned, I belong to the school that stresses that the climate crisis and the issue of mobility is to be anchored and to be fully addressed in the context of sustainable development. We need to come together and fully understand the challenges of this phenomenon, the challenges of this nexus, and how to help, increase resilience and provide solutions for adaptability to the population that will be primarily affected by the climate crisis. We need to come together beyond the different boundaries, whether it's a boundary of a city, a boundary of a state, a region, or a continent. And I think here we need to go into something which I call vertical integration, where we bring mayors, we bring the tribal chiefs together, but at the same time the big planners and the ministers with the regional policymakers and the continental. What is the agenda for action? What is the roadmap? I think the continent needs to clarify, to have a clear understanding on where it wants to go, what it needs, and how to do it. It has to be not only a top-down approach, but also a bottom-up approach, fully informed by those needs. Only then, I think it's what kind of collaboration and what's the future of cooperation we could have with our partners beyond the continent, the European Union, the UN system, but also, the various investors and partners who are interested in the continent. We need a clear plan. It needs to go beyond the band-aids that we have seen so far.
Thank you so much for that, Kamal. Thank you for that the way you've just ended off, because it pivots me back to Kanta. Kanta, we had talked about the business plan that you were going to tell us more about. The floor is now yours. And I'll just point out now that we are getting closer to the end of this discussion. So Kamal, as well as you, Kumi, you can now prepare your closing remarks. I'd like for you to just present a closing statement before we move on to the next conversation. So Kanta, back to you now on the business plan and that plan that you're leading the charge of at the World Bank.
Thank you, Christine. In honor of you and your interest on what the bank is doing, let me just put forward an announcement that just came out from the bank today. And that is that, the bank has committed, in I think it's in the coming year, to make sure that at least 35% of all the financing that they do addresses climate co-benefits. And why are we doing this? It's not because the bank is interested in climate change per se, but because development is being undermined by climate change, and we cannot ignore it, and we must address it, and we must address it upfront. And in the context of the Africa Climate Business Plan, that's exactly what we did. And this plan was launched in the middle of September this year. What we were looking at, it's not that it's a climate plan. That's not the idea. It's a development-centered climate plan. The core of it is to what Kamal said, it's that development goals, all of which are being compromised and challenged in the context of climate change. So in the plan, we have 5 strategic directions which sit at the heart of, I think if we don't address those, we certainly will see more mobility or distress-driven migration, as I call it, than we want to, but also more impoverishment, which I think is not where we want to go. So the first and foremost of this is on food security. We know as of today, there's 220 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that are food insecure. And if you talk about moderately food insecure, that goes up to 600 million. And if we don't address climate, which needs to be addressed not just on the farm, but through the markets, through the distribution systems, because when the markets are disrupted, then you don't have food security either. So that integrative approach to food security is important. And I underscore this back to your migration conversation. The ultimate reason why somebody moves out of distress is food. It's a security for themselves and for their family. So food security sits at the heart, not just of the whole development conversation, but also in terms of our migration conversation we're having today. The second is, I talked about it a little bit, is the energy security. 500 million don't have energy today. If we continue at our current pace of energy access, at 2030 or 2050, I can't remember, we will still have another 500 million people without energy access. That's because of the population increase. So we need to ramp it up, and if the world wants Africa to be having clean energy, then we need to help Africa. It's something that's fundamental. The third part, and I won't go into all of them, but I want to touch on the urbanization and the cities. You mentioned that all of those cities are in Africa. 400 million people live in African cities today, and they will triple to 1.2 billion. And of that, you have a whole youth bulge. There is a real opportunity here for Africa to not just have the same type of cities, but green, clean, and really resilient cities. And that, I think, is one of the visions as well in the plan. So within the plan, we have targets, we have directions, and we really hope that the financing that the bank can leverage will come to bear. And I talked about that sort of 35% off the top of every investment. There's also a dedicated 25 billion in the next 4 or 5 years that will be just for climate financing, of which 50% should go to adaptation. But I want to just maybe wrap up with one point, 2 points. It's a related point. The first is that I think there is this displacement, as Kamal calls it, forced displacement, or this distress-driven migration. That is a reality. It's happening now. And sadly, it may continue to increase, but a lot of it is within countries. It's not just across countries. Of course, the refugees and mobility in that context is important, but there's a lot that's going to happen within the countries, and they fall between the cracks. They're not sometimes covered by any sort of conventions, and I leave that to the experts. But somehow we need to make sure that these people have some level of protection and support, and they're able to move in a safe, orderly, and dignified way. But the second part of it is to avoid this sort of and just one last line, to make sure that we don't have the trend going in the wrong direction, is to address those development needs. So let me stop there. Thank you, Christine.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kanta. Ladies and gentlemen, I did promise you concluding remarks from each of our panelists, but at this point in time, I must bring in our next speaker. Frau Claudia Roth is the Vice President of the German Parliament, the German Bundestag, the Alliance of the Greens. The reason I have to get her into the conversation now is because she too has another engagement. The Germans are busy this morning, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable Roth, it's so good to be in your company. I know that you've been with us, you've been listening to the conversation, you've been listening to the contributions. Just first take a few moments to share with us your key takeaways, Honorable Member.
Yes, indeed, we are very busy here. We have budget debates, and this is also very lively. But thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak about this very, very important aspect, climate crisis and migration. But first of all, let me say, even if Angela Merkel is ending her career, that does not mean that Germany disappears from the map. And be sure, I promise, and we are doing our utmost, that Germany will be with a next parliament and the new government even more ambitious than it was in the past. I think this has been a very lively discussion, and I'm grateful for all the different perspectives, especially for those from the Global South. I believe that Ingrid Hamm, the CEO of the Global Perspective Initiative, summarized it very well in her interview when she said climate change or climate crisis, we should speak about crisis. Climate crisis is brought to Africa, not invented there. And this is exactly the injustice that we are putting on the African continent and entire Global South. We need to take these words very, very seriously. And the remarks from Kumi that I heard, that he has made to make us Europeans uncomfortable. He said, if there would be negative impacts in Europe, the climate protection would speed up rapidly. I fear that there are already negative impacts, perhaps not to compare with other parts of the world, but he's right, the climate protection would speed up rapidly. He's demanding a system change, not just little details that are adjusted and compares the situation of the world with the Titanic, and he is fully right. I'm convinced we need to encounter this challenge together, and those countries in particular who are over proportionally emitting climate gases, especially the industrialized stage, such as Germany. And what is at stake is nothing less than a question of global justice, in which vulnerable groups such as women, children, minorities, indigenous population are the first to be left behind.
Honorable Roth, I do want to squeeze in two more questions for you that I'll put together in one. I know that your party, the Greens, you've made a proposal in the German parliament that would essentially allow persons that are threatened by statelessness, and I imagine people that are impacted by climate change would fall under that, to get passports here in Germany. That's something that you proposed to the parliament, but you did get a lot of opposition to that. In fact, I think I heard a lawmaker make reference to the fact that it would make Germany the Noah's Ark of the world. What do you make of just that? What does that reflect, the fact that there was such opposition to such an idea as you presented it to the parliament?
First of all, I think it was very, very important that we put this item, which is only in a niche, which was never discussed before in the German parliament or even in German politics, on the agenda. One spoke, of course, about political refugees. One spoke about and speaks about 80 million refugees worldwide. But never, ever again one spoke about the forced migration, people who would even lose their home. I was not long ago in Kiribati, which is an island in the Pacific. I spoke to people, to men, to women, and they are only a few centimeters, and then the whole state will disappear. So what will happen to these people? Do we allow these people also to disappear? I was in Bangladesh, terribly already addressed by the climate crisis. Every day, more than 2,000 people from the south, from the mangrove area, moving to the capital, which is a hell on earth meanwhile. And we put it on the agenda and we said we will have a high number. And if you don't believe the Green Party of Germany or the Green European Party, then believe the World Bank. They spoke about, it was already mentioned about, I think, 140 million. And the United Nations speaker last week, he spoke about 1 billion of people forced to leave their houses, their homes, because there's a mixture of climate crisis, the COVID pandemic, and the other crisis. So you asked me about the widespread opposition we received, and I personally received that. This was really, I had to feel honored because this opposition and this hate was so widespread. The hate against this proposal was really disgraceful. But it shows that too many in our parliament or in our politics do neither sufficiently acknowledge the climate crisis and their consequences, We have even those who are denying it. We have those who are following Trump in his crazy ideas. Nor the fact that people are being displaced by the dramatic chances. And we saw that anti-democratic populists and extreme right were framing that all displaced people would want to come to Germany. So that Claudia Roth want to bring them all to Germany. This is, of course, absolute nonsense. I spoke to a fisherman in Tuvalu. Does anybody believe that these fishermen want to come to a refugee camp in Germany, in Bavaria? I spoke to a woman in Kiribati, and she said, I want to stay here because my graveyards of my family are here. I do not want to go to a refugee camp anywhere in the world. But then you have to act. You have to act now. You have to do your utmost that we can stay at home. And if not, you have to allow us migration in dignity. And if that's not enough, you have to, what we did to define this passport, this climate passport, which will allow people who lost everything to come to these countries who are the main responsible for the loss of the poor people.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I did ask, one of my questions was going to be, Germany's responsibility in this and leading the charge. I believe you've done a fair job in elaborating that, but I will indulge you, Honorable Roth, if you feel you need to say more. Otherwise, I can let you go at this stage.
No, I think I'm convinced that Germany needs to take the lead in a fight for a just and equal world. And it is a question of justice. It's a question of justice. And we just, 1 hour ago, when I was at the presidency of the parliament debate, we spoke about global justice if it comes to vaccine, to access to vaccine against the COVID pandemic. And I think that Germany has to do more. This is exactly my expectation. And I'm convinced that climate-induced migration is an issue that urgently needs open dialogues between countries and multilateral platforms to create safe pathways for migration, to create a status that protects those who are likely to become stateless. Because there's no status. It's not the asylum right where we can deal it. But it needs to be that we discuss this status to protection for those who, and I fear they will become stateless, these Pacific Island population. But I think if we speak about forced migration, if we speak about refugees, climate crisis refugees, we should not forget our priority. And our priority must be that nobody is forced to leave their home. That means we need to stand side by side with those who are already experiencing the consequences of a changing climate. We need to help them to build resistance and provide support, not just monetarily, but also by sharing techniques, innovations, and conduct research on what works best. We have to discuss losses and damages. And I was in several climate conferences. I was in Poland and in France and in other parts of the world. And if it comes to losses and damages, there is silence all around. And that is a lack of responsibility of all those who are mainly responsible for the losses and for the damages.
Thank you so much. I know that you now have to leave us and get to your schedule for the day, or your other part of the schedule. Thank you so much. And thank you for just the passion with which you have spoken. And I'll take the time perhaps to tell our audience who may not be affair with politics here in Germany. But in the last general election, the growth of the Greens was really the story of the day. You could see that message is coming through from, it's reaching the people of Germany in terms of the climate action that is needed, something that Honorable Roth's party is championing. Thank you for that, and we will.
Perhaps let me add something which is positive. Let me add, if you mentioned the elections, of course we asked people were asked what is the priority for them. And for example, in one of the German states in Bavaria, people said number one is climate crisis. So people are well aware of it. And now we are really stressed and we have this challenge of the COVID pandemic also in a very rich Germany. And what concerns me a lot is that in these pandemic times with terrible consequences all over the world, the crisis, the other crisis, the climate crisis is pushed away, it's marginalized, it's forgotten. And this would be a terrible, terrible mistake. So sorry that I have to leave you, my good friends, the family, but we will come together for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess to our organizing partners, that is, of course, the message that we need to be brought together again in conversation. Thank you for that, Honorable Roth. Of course, there will be still be a Germany after Merkel, that assuring message coming through from the Deputy Speaker of the German Parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, now I want to bring back my 3 Ks into the conversation. The 3 Ks, no, not the Kardashians. I'm talking about Kanta, Kumi, and of course Kamal. You guys have our concluding remarks. And then to our audience, we are going to do those breakaway sessions again. Now, normally we have a breakaway session for each individual, but what we're going to do is we're going to put them all in one session. So guys, I need you to do it in 30 seconds. Your concluding remarks, and perhaps let's do it this way. I will start with you, Kamal, and then we will go over to Kanta, and then we will hand over to Kumi. 30 seconds.
I think the only, if I am to note something very sensitive, it's the only failure is to give up. It's doable. Right. We can do it. Okay. It was done before. The key here is to do it differently, to do it with creativity, and to ensure the needed commitment. It's about people. And we should put back people at the heart of the climate action. When it comes to the continent, a mobile continent is a healthy continent. Yeah. When it comes to mobility, a mobile continent is a resourceful continent. When it comes to employment, it's what the best the continent can offer. It's just how do we do it? The sequencing in doing it and the commitment. As I said, I don't want to discuss numbers here, but this should go beyond what we have done before. We should do it differently, and we should bring the Africans on board. There is tremendous commitment from the UN. There is tremendous commitment from many countries, and Germany is a champion. Actually, the conversation today was an easy conversation. Ambassador Heusgen is a champion when it comes to this aspect. We rely on these champions to convince others to come forward and to do better and to do more. I'll stop here. Thank you again.
We can do it. Thank you for that reassuring message. Kamal, over to you, Kanta.
Thank you. There's a couple of things. The first is, I think that, climate migration is a reality, but it doesn't have to be a crisis. It's what we're going to do differently. And I want to come back to what we talk about COVID being the sort of conversation of today. For COVID, we could have this magic bullet and a vaccine, and we make things go away. But for climate, we got to work through it. It's a process. It's making sure we engage everybody and that everybody takes on the responsibility that they should to really make life better for everybody, particularly those who are disproportionately impacted. So let me stop there, Christine. We're then ready to help, of course.
And of course, I'll just add a sentence that you sent me in your notes, Kanta, that there are no bystanders in this, just to echo the message that you're pointing. And of course, last but not least, Kumi, over to you.
Thank you. I'm disappointed Claudia is not here because I was going to say that if it was not a virtual thing, I would be going up to her now and giving her a big hug and endorsing everything that she said. I think she brought the right kind of clarion call on the urgency and the sense of humanity that is needed. I would humbly say that this decade that we find ourselves in, 2020 to 2030, is the most consequential decade in human history. The most consequential decade in human history. What we choose to do now about how we reconfigure our economy, how we reconfigure our food system, our energy system, our transport system, all of these things need to be addressed very, very passionately, boldly, and so on. We have neglected things for far too long, and therefore small baby step changes are not going to cut it. And I see Claudia back, and I would just end by saying, Claudia, I was saying that if it was a face-to-face conference, when I was asked to say my words, I would have said, no, I'm not saying anything. I would just come and give you a hug and endorse everything that you said, because I think you got the right thing. But to end on a note of optimism, we need fresh thinking about how to address some of the problems. And Kamal, I was very impressed with your sense of the intra-migration within Africa and what potential that has for our people on the continent. And it's something that Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity, the social movement, has also been calling for. I would like to just thank everybody for their participation and for giving Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity a chance to have a voice here. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm hearing a lot about justice over there. Thank you very much, everybody, for having been with us and spending this part of your day with us. I'm sure we've all taken away a lot from the conversations that we've had over this conference, talking about climate change and migration.